So to change this times, oh, just the evidence. Okay, taking back and forth. Perfect. I'm gonna bring that a bit closer. I'm sure we'll screw anything up. Thanks so much, Kenny. You're an amazing guru.
Do you want to wait a minute for the squad?
Yep.
My phone says 102. I'm gonna wait till 103. Trickle in or keep talking? Okay.
Yes, and you're gonna trickle in throughout the hour, so that's fine.
Oh, fine.
Here, this is streaming, so.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Is it muted still? It's not. Oh, they can hear us.
Okay, so stop talking about it.
Stop.
Lindsay, can you see how many people are online?
I don't think so. I think I can only see the people logging.
Oh, I see, okay. Alrighty, well, I'm gonna get us started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Cindy Frank, and some of you know I'm the architecture librarian here. And Michael is joining us for a Speaking of Books talk today. But before I formally introduce him, I want to mention some upcoming Speaking of Books events, which you are also all invited to. The one coming up on Thursday, October 16th is Speaking of Books with Saverio Giovacchini, The Celluloid Atlantic, Hollywood, Cinecita, and the Making of the Cinema of the West, 1943 to 1973, which sounds super interesting because it's movies. And that's going to be Thursday, October 16th from 1 to 2 at McKeldin Library. And then the one after that on October 27th, 4 to 6 p.m. is How I Was a Designer, Vladimir Paperny in conversation with Sasha Razor. And Vladimir is an author, designer, and architectural historian. And he's going to talk about his work, which should be very interesting. And that's October 27th, 4 to 6 p.m. also in McKeldin. And yeah, I'm going to go to that one for sure. So now here we are. I would like to introduce our clinical full professor, Michael Abrams, who is a returning Speaking of Books person. And this is good. So every year or so you could come talk to us about the next book. But today, Michael's going to speak with us about metaphoric architecture, transforming ideas into 3D form. And hopefully we're going to hear about the how metaphors from art, music, and film inspire architectural design. Thank you
very much. Thanks. Should I be standing or sitting for the, doesn't matter.
It follows you.
It's better to sit? All right, I'll sit there. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your schedule to be here with me to talk about my new book, Metaphoric Architecture. It just came out in July, so just a few months ago. I have this copy. I'm gonna pass it around for you guys to browse it and see if there's some more information about it. Now, I want to thank first of all Cindy Frank and Lindsay Carpenter for hosting me and putting together this event. Also our trusted, Kenny, our IT and guru guy, who was able to put this live stream and broadcast it through YouTube and Facebook. So for those of you who don't know me, Michael Abrams, I'm a full professor, a clinical full professor here. I'm from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I'm currently been now in Maryland for 10 years. However, I've been teaching now for 20 years in other institutions. And teaching here at Maryland has brought me many great honors, from Mentor Award, Faculty Mentor Award to Student Teaching Award, There have been a couple of the great honors that I received. I've also been a mentor to our Latin community here, our Latinx Architects United students group, which is a really great honor to be spearheading that organization with our students. Now, I'm talking about today's my second book. My first one, the Outer City Sketching, which some of you guys I think had to purchase when you were in Art 200. Right now, it's in the second edition. The first book I published it with Routledge, and same as the second one. I really have a really good, trusted relationship with those folks. So when I was thinking about this idea about the writing, about the design process and design thinking, I immediately went to them, Routledge, and they said yes. They'd love to have you and write another book and publish it with you guys. So this book, different from the other one, the Outer City Sketching is about drawing, observing, transforming what we see in the built environment on paper using, pen, pencils, etc. This one, and that was more about representation. This is more about the design thinking, kind of demystifying the design process. And how do we take an idea as something that is abstract and make it habitable, make it palpable, make it actually spatial, right? For this, I look into different themes. One of the three themes I looked into were music, art, and film. And what I did with that is I took each one of those themes, right? And I start to look at the main attributes or characteristics of those features and how to take those attributes and features and convert and transform them into space design, okay? Now, the book also presents an abundance of precedent analysis or case studies that I went through in my research. Now, the precedent analysis that I'm showing in this book is not just architectural speaking. I'm also showing precedents in art, like pieces of work from Piet Mondrian, Juan Gris, Pablo Picasso, also pieces of film, like Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, Inception by Richard Nolan, Boyhood, and also pieces of music as well, from the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, among others, right? So I'm thinking of those themes as a way to how to connect them with architecture. Now, in the book, I want to mix theory with analysis and imagery. So that means that each chapter is packed with diagrams, drawings, models, collages, etc. And they're all part of the learning process. As architects, we're visual, creatures. We learn by looking and seeing how other people draw and how people work, right? Now, many of you guys know, right, that architectural education is accumulative. So my intention is for every chapter to be more challenging than the previous one. So in a way, it becomes a guidebook, a textbook, in which students can start working their exercises in the first chapter. And by the time they reach the fourth chapter, they acquire a type of knowledge throughout that journey. Okay. So the exercises that are shown on chapter 4, you can just jump into it. You kind of have to follow the logic, follow the different type of chapters. The book, the outline is very simple. I have 4 chapters only. I start from the very basic design fundamentals, and then I jump into the different type of themes or topics that I discuss at the beginning of this talk, in which I'm looking into art and architecture, music and architecture, film and architecture. Within each chapter, I'm including different types of design tips, as well as exercises. And the way that I pick these particular topics, I'm going to stand up for a second here. So these art, music, film, I follow criteria, and because it could have been anything, it could have been nature, it could have been literature, it could have been so many different things, right? So I wanted to, first of all, look at themes that have comparable characteristics between architecture and these art, music, and film. Also, look at metaphoric application in the formation of the built environment. How easy it is to take those characteristics and transform them into space. And also how frequent, they're being used by world-renowned architects. People from Stephen Hall, Philip Johnson, Le Corbusier, right? How they implemented these topics or metaphors into their own design. And finally, the last criteria that I used to create for these particular themes were years of research, my own research, either personal interest in topics, interviews, architectural projects, which I'm going to show you in today's lecture, as well as analysis that I've worked with. Now, the book, as I mentioned earlier, is filled with precedent analysis. For example, like case studies like the Rietville Schroeder house, right? Which is a great example of how you can take something. It's probably the closest example of a Mondrian painting turned into habitable spaces, into three-dimensional space. Now, the book, same as my previous book, I wanted to make sure that it contribute to the architectural program or the architectural field, right? So I'm gonna make sure that it has some pedagogical features, so instructors from other universities can also utilize it in their own classroom, right? From showing illustrations from problem seeking to problem solving methods, using the guidebook as a practical and demonstrative approach, meaning kind of like following, seeing how people can solve a problem or multiple people can solve the same problem, right? If I'm giving a particular student a problem, here I'm showing in the book different solutions from that one particular problem. So it's not just one. I also tackled the why behind space making, and the what and the how are illustrated in the wide range of images and representation techniques that I'm showing, right? I'm also showing analysis and diagrams of world-renowned buildings by famous architects or canonical work. Now, and at the end, the most important aspect of this as a pedagogical feature was to encourage readers to think and learn through the act of making. So that way they're not just passive readers, they actually at the end of each chapter, they have exercises that they have an opportunity to actually create and design. So I'm giving them problems, giving design problems in each chapter with examples of past solutions. Now, the term metaphoric architecture in the book is somewhere around there. Is I didn't came up with that, right? It's originated back in Europe in mid-20th century, in which it mixes functionalism and artistic expressionism, and it has grand gestures that lack decorative motifs. One of the great examples probably is, guys know this one, Ronchamp, Notre du Hot by Le Corbusier. Kind of that metaphor of kind of the handspring and the veil of a nun's cornet, right? So in here in Washington, D.C., there's also, they have many symbols. One of them, the US Capitol, right? It's a metaphor for American democracy and a representative government, right? Designed by William Thornton. So here we can see an example of architecture as a metaphor, as a symbol of something greater than some of its parts. Now, when I first started teaching, I stumbled into this quote by Albert Einstein, and it stick with me throughout my studio career, my instructor career, in which he said that imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. All we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the world. In a way, he's saying, imagination is boundless, versus knowledge has its own limit based on how much you know, right? So that's one of the things that I tend to drive a project in my studio, kind of make sure that students are being creative, they're being playful when they're designing, right? They're not thinking ahead of what the solution is going to be, but more about play, right? And think about play and playfulness as part of the research as well. Almost like let's do drawings, let's do collages, let's see what sticks, right? So when we start a project in studio, and I typically teach the foundation studio for those of you guys who don't know me, I teach Studio 1, Studio 2. We typically start by doing a lot of drawings and models, right? And sometimes it will start with a word, or sometimes it start with a simple sketch, right? And I actually put this test, I put this to the test last year with my 10-year-old son. And yeah, and asked him I want you to design a fortress. Just draw it for me, right? And he this kind of this more menacing looking fortress with dismembered arm sticking out for some reason. And that's okay. Now we're gonna take it and build a model using just one material, in this case, Legos, right? And so in the process of the act of creating, of making, he started to design new spaces and new interpretations of the original sketch. Here we have only one tower, and it has two towers. And instead of being a bat cave, now it's all for Star Wars, but that's beyond the point. The thing is that he's creating something that went beyond the sketch, something that he let his imagination kind of go free and design something new that was not there before in the original intention. And it's something that I carried through in my lessons with my students as well, in which we will start maybe with a sketch, and then we move to the model, and then the model will start to take its own form and shape and start to become live, right? Now, sometimes the concept may start with a sketch, sometimes it's a word, right? So in today's presentation, I want to show you some of my work that I've done when I was a student and a professional, right? In particular, I'm going to be talking about chapter 3, which is about music and architecture and how those two start to relate. Actually, that was the first chapter that I wrote when I was putting together this book. This is a project that I did way back in 1994 when I was a student in Puerto Rico, which is a place for your hobby. And the idea was to basically take your hobby and make it into something habitable. And the time was to play guitar, right? So the first model that I did, it looked like a stupid guitar. And the teacher crucified me. It's like, no, I mean, this is too literal. Where's the abstraction? Where's the idea of the concept, right? This is not Haro Cafe, right? So what does it mean, to embody this pavilion, right? So I started thinking about the language between auditive and visual connection that exists between architecture and music. So that was my first approach in thinking in a more abstract way. So I was trying to kind of denote those similar characteristics or elements like rhythm, harmony, datum, intention, that they all exist within music and architecture. So it's like, So a light bulb went up in my head, and so I can start playing with that instead of being so literal. So I started to think about reinterpreting the elements of the guitar through the story of those architectural elements, right? To create this pavilion. One of the first things I did was analyze my own project in thinking about, well, I want to have some kind of datum that becomes eventually my plinth or base, right? This will be my representation of a sound box, which is going to be the performance space with skylight oculus. Then I'm going to have kind of this progressive rhythm, but it's being reinterpreted through the structure and the circulation of the spaces. And also, when you play an instrument, especially a stringed instrument, there's a lot of tension that you have to press down to sound it out, right? To pluck it. So the same thing I wanted to create here, a moment of tension in which people go down into the space, they're compressed, and then expands into this performing room area, which at the time I drove into inspiration from Taliesin by Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright, in which the summer before I was able to visit Taliesin. And I draw that inspiration because a lot of his spaces were very tight and then compress you and then expands you to the big space. So that part of architectural knowledge and visiting also guided me through this particular project. So with this particular project, I was able to also experiment with the idea of acoustics, which has some acoustical paneling systems that I wanted to project beyond the roof, almost like as a metaphor of music escaping the performance space. And then having part of the tension cables, not only to represent tension, but also to have kind of vines that over time will grow and create a type of very comfortable entry to the people performing here. Now, this as kind of one of my first attempts at creating architecture, it taught me many great lessons. The first of all is there's a beauty, the architecture is about poetry and beauty, right? And then there's also beauty in the abstraction, in the process of thinking in abstract terms. It also helped me to start thinking about the definition of architecture, not what the dictionary will tell me. In this case, architecture for me enhances the human experience through a spatial sequence, stimulating moments for the users. Now, years later, when I was in grad school, I was able to keep exploring that relationship between music and school in a whole completely way and manner. This is when I was at the University of Michigan. It was my graduate thesis, in which at the time I was into jazz music, like Tito Puente and Miles Davis, and I used to love that, how creative the music was and how they start to overlap rhythms. They have overlapping instruments that sometimes the melody is being played by another instrument and another melody is played by another instrument, and they somehow overlap and create this beautiful symphony or cacophony of sounds, right? So I took to experiment that. I started to look at the design elements of jazz music, like improvisation, syncopation, irregular transition, and overlays that exist in that music, and translate it into physical form. Now, in this case, one of the things that I did was look into how a musical composition, you may start somewhere and then something happens. There's an interruption. In this case, a bridge or interlude, what we call in music. So in this case, that interlude or bridge is represented by this red wall, in which shift the movement of the persons as they enter from the south, and then they cross through that red wall into the main space, and then switches again into the classrooms, which are these guys, right? Into this kind of hallway, very tight hallway. Now, that is all part of the movement that I want to kind of, as a metaphor from jazz music, bring into architecture. I also brought this idea of the polyrhythm that exists in jazz music, with two different rhythms overlapping. In this case, is exemplified by two different grid systems and how they work together to create spaces. Now, in this case, the first rhythm, right, kind of follows more rhythmic pattern, in which is kind of more equidistant from each other. And then we have kind of the secondary rhythm, kind of diagonal to the first one, and perpendicular to that red wall. That does create a type of interesting shift within the classrooms and the grid systems. Now, by doing this in plan, it also affected the facade, which is when you enter into the building, we have this couple of classrooms that appear to be floating, like floating notes within the staff. And that's how I kind of created with that particular facade. A great lesson from this was that limitations are important because they evoke creativity. When we're thinking about if you're designing, the whole world's endless with possibilities, but you start to narrow it down and start to establish your own set of rules for yourself when you're designing, that actually can help you to understand how to take that your design a step further into the real environment, right? Kind of like that book Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, in which a stranded man in this island, and they only have one material to work with. And he makes clothes, he makes a chair, he makes a boat, he makes all this stuff out of this very limited palette, right? And the same thing, that's the way I approach my design studios, in which I'll give students maybe a kit of parts or a particular series of constraints to work with, so that way they can evoke their creativity. Otherwise, if they do whatever, it becomes very difficult for them to start thinking what is the next step to take, right? The third project I want to show you, then this is years later. This is the Sound Room, which is an international design competition in Madrid, in Spain, in which this is a very interesting proposal. It was for a company called Sound Room, in which they wanted to create a type of rehearsal performance spaces for musicians to come play for musicians in Madrid. Now, the site is a type of warehouse in the north side of Madrid, in which this is the site. It's just one of these warehouses, and they wanted to have 3 performance spaces embedded in there. They wanted to create this almost like you have a gym membership, you go and pay a fee for the gym membership. So similar to that, here you pay a membership and you go and rehearse, and you play music in one of these performance spaces. You're renting out the performance space. So the exterior couldn't be touched. It all had to be interior-wise. So the first thing I looked into is that, well, I don't want to deal with jazz or the guitar again. What else can I do under the umbrella of music? And this is going to be for musicians to play. So I started looking at sound waves and acoustics for this particular project. And how can I take maybe something that's one dimensional, like a sound wave, and make it into habitable spaces, spaces that actually will engage people and make them want to come back into the spaces, right? And make them intrigued with the spaces being created here. So the first thing I did was take the sound wave and I projected it. Now it becomes two-dimensional. Then I place it within the site and extrude it to give it volume. Once I do that, I start to create kind of this paneling system. Now, the paneling system that you see there is acoustical panels, but also they support the performance spaces. I also went back to the original music and architecture elements, right? Like the rhythm, datum, tension. In this case, the two performance spaces are physically shown as three descending notes. The datum is a musical staff, which actually are the vertical panels that supports those performance spaces. And the tension is created between the mix of both of them to create the performance room. And I'm very proud of this. I got honorary an award for it. One thing that I wanted to play with is also with light, in which there's a skylight, an existing skylight throughout the day, that when you're a musician playing music, sometimes the hours go by, you don't realize, you play for 5 hours, 6 hours, right? So that way, when the sun moves, you can tell the time of day throughout the movement of the light and how it's affected inside the space, almost like a sun clock or a sundial within the spaces. And here's a study, there's a model study of that sunlight that I was telling you about from the morning, noon, and afternoon. So it's a way to tell time when you're just rocking out in those spaces. And in the book, I show, again, just examples like these, and also examples from colleagues, from art architects like Stephen Hall and the Stretto House, how he also used music to design his spaces. Okay? I also analyze the different pieces of music and how it can be interpreted into architecture, from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. Now, the other chapters, one of them, the second chapter is looking into art and architecture. And this is an example that I give, a project that I give my students in Art 400 and Art 200, which is, most of you guys have done it here, the Mondrian painting analysis of the Mondrian object, right? In which we start with looking at a Mondrian painting, and we start analyzing it, creating diagrams. The act of going from here to here starts to distance ourselves from this, which is what I want for students. Because then they're going to start creating a model based on their diagrams. So now they're distancing themselves even further from this, which is what I want. For this object to start taking a life of its own. It becoming its own entity. The other thing that we work with in this particular project is primary elements: point, line, plane, and volume. So the basic, kind of the ABCs of architecture when we start working in this particular project. Another parameter that I give students is that I only use two materials, dowels and planes. That's it, right? And the third parameter is that it can be picked up and seen from any angle. So there's no base, there's no sight. It's just an object. So as we rotate the object, we learn different spatial and volumetric possibilities. Another example that I talk in the book is the palimpsest collage, which I used to give this in Art 300. It's an interesting project in which I tell students to design a space, right, imaginary space, using a particular palette of materials, foam core board, magazines, and string, and that's it. So how we using those limited palette, we can create imaginary spaces that may drive a type of conversation or maybe even a concept later on, right? And this is a great way of thinking about spaces that is not drawing and it's not model, right? It's something in between, using collages to generate ideas, to generate potential spaces. So if you're stuck with either one of them, here's another way of looking at it, doing collages. The final chapter of the book deals with film and architecture. And here for this one, I'm looking at different type of films from Rear Window, Boyhood, Inception, analyzing them. and how we can actually use elements of film to create space, either a spatial sequence or envision ourselves as directors, as how we're moving through the planes and the cameras to design spaces. Philip Johnson, one of the most famous American architects, famously wrote that when he designs, he always starts by closing his eyes and thinking about himself walking from the car to the entrance and what happens after you open doors to that building. So he's thinking about it almost like a director. Like, what is that sequence that's guiding me before I start drawing anything? And I thought that was really innovative at the time. So some of the exercise or some of the projects that I show are from one of them from Philip Johnson, another one from a former UMD alumni. I was his thesis chair, Timothy Shook. He did a film studios in Toronto, Canada. And he actually looked at the way that the director pans the camera throughout actors, right? And how how a director frames scenes. And that was part of the concept, a frame sequence. How you can create, and he started with this kind of small partie diagram, kind of showing this perspective of frame sequence. And he didn't know what this would let him, but he just started with that. And then eventually became a partie model with the frames. You see the red string is kind of a way to denote the circulation, the movement through the spaces. These are not spaces yet. This is just an idea represented in model, what we call a partie model. And then from there, then start to generate actual spaces with framing, structure, and catwalks. So that red string now becomes elevated catwalks and bridges. And these frames now become structural elements that carry a type of rhythm throughout the entire complex. And this is we're talking about a whole year of work for this particular project. He ended up getting the best thesis award that year. So very proud of him. Now, when I was writing this book, I got a question from one of my students. It's like, so once I finish that book, will I be able to design a triangular Wright or Talabando? Hell no, right? It's the same as, trying to play guitar and buying a Santana book, thinking by the end of the book, I'm going to play just like Carlos Santana. It's not going to happen, right? You need years of practice, you need dedication, rigor, passion, right? So the book, instead, what it does is supports the architectural education of its readers, whether it's a student, architect, or novice, or someone who's just interested in architecture, right? It supports the architectural education by presenting several creative methods of design, design tips, precedent analysis and diagramming, as well as exercises in each chapter. So that way they're engaged with active design. Again, how to take an idea into an actual habitable space. Now, to conclude today's presentation, I want to leave you with this quote. This is by Bruce Mao, a Canadian professor, artist, and graphic designer. And he described process as more important than outcome. When the outcome drives the process, we will only ever go to where we already been. So one of the things that I love about that particular quote is that even if you've done, let's say, you're a residential architect, you've done many residential residences, right? Maybe the approach you take can be different every time. It doesn't need to be the same way, right? Now there's a tendency, especially from students, to just jump into SketchUp, which I think may not be the best way to approach a design, right? In computer form, maybe start by looking into collages or sketches or model making, right? Be what the process takes you, see where it drives you, right? Be open to interpretation and possibilities. Kind of let that imagination roam free, as Albert Einstein said. All right. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah, so Michael has agreed to answer some questions. So feel free to ask.
And the book is around someplace floating.
It's on the table.
Yeah, you can pass it around, Amelia. Yeah. Professor Vandergrift.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and talking us through the themes. I really appreciated that final quote that was about process. I 100% agree. And it's I've been thinking a lot about making as a way of knowing, right?
Yeah.
And all of the different ways that we make, and it seems like there's a continuum of tools from hand tools and actually constructing buildings as a
Yeah.
way of knowing, but also drawing buildings. And then I immediately think of like AI as probably the most
Mhm.
recent tool in this long
Yeah.
list of tools. And I'm just curious to hear from you where you're placing that discussion, because it seems like this book is a really rich, like series of different tools and different ways of making this. So that's kind of, I don't know, I mean, we've been talking a lot
Yeah.
about that, but my mind goes there and I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
That's a good question, because that was one of the things that my publisher immediately asked, what about AI? So I dive into it right at the chapter 1, in which in Art 400, Studio 1, Studio 2, we've done AI workshops, as you may know, and it's here, right? It's almost impossible to stop. So
Like, sorry if you went over that already.
no, not at all. But it's interesting to see how, it is, if you think about it, like 30 years ago when AutoCAD first came out, all the adjustments, either you have to adapt or you're out, right?
Right.
So now we have in the AI generation. So in a way that I talk about it in the book is thinking of using AI as part of the design process, like another tool, right? It's not going to replace human instinct and human creativity, right? It just shows different possibilities in what can be generated at the initial phase. Actually, right now in Studio 2, my guys don't know it, but we're going to do an AI workshop in a few weeks, just dealing with facades, right? See what happens. It's kind of the playfulness of it, right? And see what can the tool can produce, right? Whether what we can produce, right? But it's here, and other firms like Bondstrand, Hersign, and Gensler, they actually adapt as well AI as part of their original schemes when they meet with clients as well.
Interesting, because I've used it some, but not a lot, and my impression is right now, as a newly evolved tool, it is taking your quote about like, if the outcome is always the goal, like, we'll always have the same process, or I'm summarizing, but
Yeah.
as a tool right now, it almost seems like it's taking the outcomes that are already out there and synthesizing them in new ways. And so in that way, it's like this weird mix between outcome driven and process. And of course, the risk is that if the critical thinking and the process goes away, it's going to be like the recycling of the same outcomes. I don't think that will happen, because I think humans are very much involved with their creativity, but it's interesting, especially with.
I don't know if you ever use this software, Crea, KREA, which is an AI generated software that you can put like 2 images and they give you a percentage, like how much AI you want to involve, etc. But if you take it, if you put it all the way to 100, it turns into a military tank, whatever you do. It was really weird. We tried it last year
Don't do that.
in 400, and it's like, okay, we're never going to use that program again. So instead, we use like LookX or Midjourney.
So, that's very interesting. Thanks for the talk, Michael, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
One of the things I've discovered in trying to write a book is they don't write themselves, so impressive achievement.
They don't?
I gotta take exception with this book, because I think what it suggests is that process legitimizes the outcome. And I think it ignores the fact that one of the things we're trying to do with students is to teach them judgment as a kind of corollary process. In other words, when you engage in a process, you produce several things. What you want students to learn is how to judge which of those things they produce is better, or solves the problem best. And I think that what this suggests is that by putting process above that ability to judge and decide things, it legitimizes it in a way. And part of the problem that I have with that is that it's very deterministic, and I think the computer, all the sort of parametric modeling and the lighting things that people do and stuff, tends to optimize one condition, and therefore the process tends to, in a way, legitimize, only that, right? And I think one of the things we have to do in terms of education of these people here is teach them judgment. And your books are a lot about precedent. I'm a little sorry you didn't talk more about that. Because I think one of the things we try to do is teach them, the history and the theory of good architecture, so they can build their own judgment to decide as they engage in the process, which things are more useful and which things are less useful. And so I think it's, for me anyhow, it's only part of the equation.
Yeah.
That really, the business of knowledge and judgment is equally as important as engaging in the process that takes you to different places.
Yeah.
Any reaction to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because also in the book, they talk about the idea of, again, precedent analysis and understanding that each building, you can have a wealth of precedents, right? You can use a catalog of different precedents just for one building, not just using one. Like if you're looking for a design, a particular atrium or stair, maybe you look at different type of precedents for that. If you're looking at using wood construction, what kind of precedents are out there, right? So it's all part of using your judgment as well by looking at precedents. And it's not just, and that research is also part of the process. It's not just making stuff.
But at the end, you have to decide.
Oh, you have that.
You can't say to a client,
Definitely.
oh, we got four different
Definitely.
things here. You could, that doesn't work. You
Yeah.
have to, you
And,
have to come down on one side of the issue somewhere.
and the decision also occurs both in studio and the practice when you have meetings, right?
Yeah.
And when you have reviews. That's what those are for. So that helps you to start to narrow it down your decision making. So that way it comes, the end of December, you never met with your professor or have reviews, you have like all these ideas. So that's why those are important, reviews and client meetings.
And I think for students, one of the most important lessons is learning how to delay judgment until you engage the creative process.
Well,
Students sometimes mix the two things up. They try to judge something while they're making. Very hard to do.
Yeah.
Sort of say, I'm gonna wait and just create more things until I have enough to be able to judge.
Yeah, so almost like what sticks and what works, right? Sometimes they're looking for approval by the teacher, right? When it's not what I want. I mean, I want ice cream, but
I always say-
what?
There's two kinds of students, the kind that study the subject and the kind that study the teacher.
Yeah, no, it's like, that's a good put it. You should write a book about that.
That's an old Italian architecture school study.
Thank you,
Good stuff.
love the images, love the book, congrats.
Anything
All of these are successful metaphors. Do you have a metaphor going wrong?
else? Oh, that could be another whole book, but yeah, definitely. I mean, they're metaphors or ideas that they don't go anywhere, right? And that goes to one of the lessons I teach my students, like, don't fall in love with a concept. Don't fall with an idea, because it could be a nasty divorce if it doesn't work out, right? You could, spend weeks and weeks working on a particular concept that leads you nowhere. You have to kind of scratch that and go over it, right? So, I mean, there are many of that case, especially here in this film. Great question.
What's the next book, Mark?
So for now, I'm gonna take a break, because I just spent 2.5 years writing this. I might take a little break from writing books. Cindy?
Question going the other way. Have you ever, I am mindful of like various thesis students who use music or
Oh, yeah.
some musical theories as a framework for their. But do you ever watch a movie, say, and go, well, that's totally a riff on, some art, like a Gary artist, like the reverse,
Oh, that's interesting.
art inspired by architecture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Since I always see it from the point of view as an architect,
Right?
and mostly, like, for example, the movie Inception could be a really great example of that,
Yes,
in which architecture is almost like the main character of that film,
Yeah.
not really Leonardo DiCaprio.
Right.
Is the art of making buildings and the building environment.
yes.
That is the main character of that film. Which actually I talk a lot of that in the book,
Okay.
in chapter 4, yeah.
We have
Lindsay.
some questions from online, and I think the one I'll ask first, I don't think we've touched on yet, but how do you think people in the other spatial disciplines represented in the school, urban planning, historic preservation, real estate development, could adapt the techniques or lessons applied to architecture?
Oh, that's fantastic, yes. I mean, landscape architects do, interior designers as well, right? I mean, these are design fields, you know, even graphic design too, right? That they can adapt those basic ideas and transform in either in habitable spaces, like landscape or interior design or urban plan, urban design, right? So even though I'm an architect first and foremost, right? So I take that approach, but I can see that being employed in other design fields. Yeah. Like for example, a great one that I included was Park Andrea Citron's Parc de la Ville, no, the Parc de la Ville, no, the Parc Citron, Andrea Parc Citron in Paris, in which the landscape, there was a landscape architect team, right? In which they designed the space and the sequence is equivalent to almost like a design director, in which how they take snapshots and then they transform that into living spaces throughout the sequence in that park. It's a fantastic park in Paris. And it provides you with different points of view. They can go elevator, you can go below, or you can go at ground level. So allows you to see the park from multiple angles, like a cameraman. You know, and I thought that was a fantastic project that I was going to analyze in my last final chapter. Roger Williams.
Yeah, I just love the whole project and the
Yeah.
way you've been teaching these methods over the years and. I do find myself fascinated by the idea that architecture communicates through metaphors. And I teach this course on the history of structure. And what I've come to understand is architecture cannot express structure, but through metaphor. It has to make up some story, some visual dynamic about how structure works, because forces are invisible. You have to simplify it somehow. You have to come up with the story of load and support, for example, or the story of primary structural members and secondary, when all of it's actually part of the load solution. So I'm fascinated by that, and I just, it's not so much a question than a musing.
Oh, thanks so much, appreciate it. Dan,
Hi.
thanks for coming, by the way.
I'm interested in how music, art, and film connects architecture to wider culture.
To where?
To wider culture.
Oh, wider culture.
And kind of creating this bigger dialogue of culture. Do you speak in the book about context and how the dialogue of which artist, which film, what perspective,
Yeah.
how that enriches the building, so it's not
A bubble,
Yeah.
yeah, perfect, great question. So a couple of samples that actually go back here. Like this one, for example, this is when I did the music school. This is my graduate thesis. This is in Humacao, Puerto Rico, which is kind of the eastern part. It's a coastal city in Puerto Rico in the east. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is the cross ventilation and tropical winds that occurs in the island, right? So they want to create like a big, massive building and close because there's not really need for that. Here's an opportunity to have more open spaces and also to emphasize the vistas and views of the water, right? So in the examples and precedents that I give in the book, I talk greatly about the context and how some of these buildings, whether it's a slope or a different climate or a particular type of maybe cultural sensibility that we wanted to express is highlighted within the architecture, right? Another example of that would be actually this one, which is for Spaniards in Madrid, living in Madrid, that I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for Spaniards are very social people. They interact with each other. They live mostly out in urban spaces, not so much in the apartments, right? They're more about being in open crowds. So I wanted to create a spaces that down at the bottom, completely open for that interaction of musicians in Madrid. If you play rock, punk, classical music, whatever, you can interact within this space at that ground level. So I didn't want to put any walls whatsoever at the ground level, because I wanted to maintain that interaction. And when those walls open up, that garage door open up, the entrance, that becomes part of that becomes part of the grand space, the main level. So that discussion can go even outside of the building for the interaction to drink coffee or interact with their fellow musicians. Did that answer the question? Thanks so much, Diane. I appreciate you being here. All right. Lindsay, any more questions?
The other one that we found online, I think you had touched on, so a question about, using AI to enhance or transform the use of techniques in your book, and then also just future directions.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much again, everybody. If you're interested in the book, actually I put here the QR code. Feel free to snapshot and thank you again for coming. I appreciate it. No, I gotta teach too.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Let's get to look in
it's
person.
my first time to UMD. It's nice to be with the. Wait.
I mean, you're me, I can do what?
Yeah.
What's in your back?
You teach on.
No, that's one. I think it's a quick tour. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I want to introduce you to Joseph Williams. She was at the National Building Museum. He also wrote a fantastic new book.
I wrote a book about, well, I wrote, I recently edited this one on cat allergy and all day. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,